Hey, welcome to this next session on the self-sufficiency of the divine law. Our first speaker is Joseph David, who teaches law and religion at Superior Academic College. He was previously at Oxford. His latest, last publication book was Jurisprudence and Theology in Late Ancient and Medieval Judaism, and he will speak to us on this issue of the self-sufficiency of the divine law.
Can I just put on the barcode? Yep. The organizers, the sponsors of this workshop. It's a great achievement to bring us all over the world around this table, these interesting topics. Still, I'm not sure that I can present anything. So anyhow, I will start while technical issues might be solved. I'd like to address, thank you. I'd like to address the very topic of our meeting, and that is the relations between law and theology within the Judeo-Islamic milieu. More specifically, I'd like to refine the issue, or the topic, and I'm interested to deal with the relations between law and theology, rather the interplay or the interaction between law and theology. I think it's quite obvious that the person who is involved in theology, philosophy, would somehow create his legal rulings with some influence or some inspirations from the other field. So I'm not talking about the traces of philosophy within the legal rulings, the writings, but rather as how are we to situate the both fields and evaluate the differences between them and the relations between them in general. And for this task, I think it will be only natural to suggest a comparative perspective. Namely, I'd like to draw a comparative outlook from the Latin Christianity context to the Judeo-Arabic context. And I think that would help us to sharpen some of the insight, some of the features of the peculiarity of the relations between law and religion in our context. And my argument will be that it's not only about discussing different patterns of relations between law and religion. I think it goes back to a more fundamental question, which is how are we to understand law and how are we to understand theology in each and every context. So I'd like first to pay our attention to one of the very famous, I think, expressions of the relations between law and theology of Stéphane of Tournai, in his introduction to his Summa, which is a commentary on Gratia Lucratium. He describes the meeting of a theologian and a lawyer, which are invited to a banquet. He expresses his embarrassment how to satisfy both figures, and the problem is that each one of them has a different taste or different desire. The one is interested only in theological issues, in the Historia Sacra, the other one is interested in other topics, and he's really embarrassed, and the fact that he's describing this scenario at the very beginning of his commentary, I think could teach us that he is aiming to approach both of them, the theologian and the lawyer. But more than that, I think what we can learn from this introduction is that basically the differences between theology and law are differences of personality, personal differences. These are differences in taste and desires, but not differences in terms of essence and substance. Basically, what he asked his guests is to be tolerant to each other, be willing enough to tolerate the other discipline. But basically, I think he is holding the view that law and theology are not diverging substantially, but rather part of the very same thing. If we move to another very significant jurist from the Latin Christianity, Vlados de Obladis, he actually make it very clear the relations between theology and law. Law is inferior to theology and also moral philosophy. And more than that, in the second paragraph, in the third paragraph actually, he is defining the hierarchy where at the top we have philosophy or more philosophy on theology, then law, and then all the other sciences. But here and again we can see that he is approaching the relations between law and theology as sitting on one sequence. More than that, law and theology are both types of wisdom. Law is a kind of science. It's not something else than theology. So while the theologian is contemplating on some aspects of the truth or divine reality, law itself is also part of this divine reality. Now, I'd like to draw attention to some images of the law, again, from the very same context, which I could strengthen the point about the relations between law and theology. And I go back to one of the very first jurists, which was trained in Bologna in the 12th century, Ogerius, where he coins the expression "juris laqueis innodata," a very important expression which is repeatedly coming again in his writings. Now, to understand this complex expression, I think I suggest to adopt the interpretation of Andrei Padavroni, which is, I think, the most authorized commentator on Ogerius. And briefly what he's saying, that the relations between law and theology are only a matter of the state of the matter. Namely, it is only a matter of a change of form, but not a change of substance. Now, the metaphor that he uses is a metaphor of an ice break, which basically ice is the same material as fluid water. The only difference between theology, which is much more fluid, and ice break, the ice break is more rigor, is more concrete, is more tangible. But basically, law and theology, again, are the very same thing. We could draw attention to other images which describe the origins of the law in the very same way that the origins of theology and philosophy are described. They all originated from a very one unique single source. And it's not accidental that they use the Platonic images of the one, which all originate from, here and again, injustice, all of the Jura are contained along with those it still carries in the one. The Jura comes forth due to divine suggestion. They draw their origins from heaven and are proclaimed by the mouth of the prince. The most just laws and the sacred canons proceed from a single one or divine source. So basically, if I sum up the perception of law and theology within the Latin Christian context, is that law and theology are both situated on the very same sequence. Law and theology are both types of wisdoms. And basically, the main framework is a Platonic one. So the relations between law and theology are relations of emanation, in a way. Things are diametrically changed when we move to the eastern part. And I think the best expression for that is the very concentrated words of Al-Farabi, where he describes the relationships between law and theology in his words. And I will just read from the second paragraph. It is different from jurisprudence, namely theology, by the way. He's talking about kalam, which we often translate as kind of theology. I think this is one of the problems when we talk about theology in that context. I'm just questioning this way of translating the term. It is different from jurisprudence in that the jurist, the faqih, takes the opinion and the actions declared by the founder of the religion as given, it's a very important term, and sets them down as fundamentals from which he infers the things that necessarily follow from them. Whereas the dialectical theologian defends the things that the jurist uses as fundamentals without inferring other things from them. If it happens that there is a certain human being who has the ability to do both matters, he is a jurist and dialectical theologian, he defends them insofar as he is dialectical theologian, and he infers them insofar as he is a jurist. So here we have a totally different picture, or put it differently, theology is in the service of the law. If we go back to expressions from the Latin Christian context, we could also find expressions that say that law is the mistress of theology, the same line with saying that theology is the mistress of philosophy in some contexts. Here we see a totally opposite approach, that theology is in the service of the law. But more than that, theology is not about contemplating about the truth, rather it is defending the truth. Theology is therefore not about comprehending truth, or truth about reality, but rather defending some existing truth in the law. And obviously, law and theology are not wisdoms, but rather, in Aristotelian terms, are arts. They are ways of practical wisdom. They are a way to manipulate certain types of truth in reality, either to extend them, as the lawyer does, or to defend them as the theologian. So basically we have here two different settings of how to understand the relations between law and theology. But I think beyond that we see different ways to understand the meaning of law and theology separately. Law is not a reflection of the divine as we could think about in the Christian context. Rather, it's a divine content which was given at some point, revealed. Theology is not an act of comprehension, but rather an act of defense. Therefore, law and theology collaborate differently and operate differently. And I'd like to show their operation. Actually, this was part of the article which I submitted, and which I'm trying to show how the same principles, the same ideas, operate differently in each context. Now, the article deals mainly with Torat HaRikub, the catenary doctrine, which was held by 10th century Karaite jurists regarding prohibited marriages. The doctrine is very interesting, by the way. It was never titled Rikub theory by the person who held these opinions, only by their opponents who described them later on. But nevertheless, they had a very interesting and extensive idea about what kinship is about, and thus what are prohibited marriages are deriving from that. One of the significant principles of that doctrine is the principle which is coined on the book of Genesis. Therefore shall a man leave his father and mother and cleave to his wife, and they shall become one flesh. They shall become one flesh, and the catenaries understood this verse as representing the idea that men and women, when they become together, either by marriage or by sexual intercourse, they become one body or one personality, and therefore it has a lot of legal implications on various aspects. I'd like to draw only two implications of that principle, and then to compare it how this principle is dealt in the Christian tradition. So one of the aspects of applying this principle in legal ruling is that it re-articulates the meaning of and the definitions of legal acts and legal events. For example, I'm quoting from Kirkesani, I'm reading from the mid-paragraph. This is so, well, he's talking about, sorry, I'll read from the very beginning. In the phrase, the nakedness of your father, ervat avicha, means, lo tegale ervat avicha, means to inform us and teach us that the one who sleeps with his mother uncovers the nakedness of two, the nakedness of his father and the nakedness of his mother. This is so because the father and the mother, through the marriage and sexual union, have become one body and one person. As it is said, and cleave to his wife, and they become one flesh. So if they have become one body, her nakedness is necessarily also the nakedness of his nakedness, and the one who uncovers her nakedness is as if he uncovers his nakedness. This is one implication, which has a lot of other details coming from. But from the principle of one flesh, we have also other implications for the catenaries. And this is the second one. According to the principle of one flesh, the entire social, or I would say interpersonal interpersonal relations are defined differently, as we see in this ruling. And the manner of catenation, the catenaries held, that they describe these. If a man marries a woman, he and she become one soul. By the way, it's very important, the shift from one body to one soul. Likewise, if that woman marries another man, he and she become one soul. Hence, because they share the same wife, listen to that, both husbands are one soul. And the proof text is, therefore shall a man leave his father and mother and cleave to his wife, and they shall become one flesh. Now, this is part of the catenary theory, and I'm terribly sorry for missing the discussion yesterday, but I just assumed that Gregor approached the reform of Yeshua ben Yehuda. Anyhow, the reform that took place by Yeshua ben Yehuda, and which now we have all the Arabic source of the text, Sefer Yashar, is actually, I always say that it's perhaps the only legal reform in the history of halakha that we have the documents that we could trace the reform itself. We could see the arguments that was raised up by Yeshua ben Yehuda and Yosef al-Basir and their followers, and how they refuted the catenary theory. But nevertheless, the catenary theory was about how we understand the principle of one flesh and the halakhic or legal rulings that are derived from that. Now, the very same thing happens in the Christian tradition, and I will not elaborate on that, it's all in the paper. But it goes back to the New Testament verses, where they celebrate the principle of one flesh as the cornerstone of the understanding of various issues. One of them is the prohibition against divorce, the other one about idolatry, pornification, and others. And later on, when it is established within the common law tradition, it is elaborated to the very same conclusion of the extent of relative degrees of relatives which are prohibited to marry. Now, within the article, I argued that the differences between, actually the interaction or the similarities between the catenaries and the Christian tradition is quite striking for various reasons. And I can only refer to the late Shlomo Pines and Patricia Krohn and others who emphasize the relations between Christian ideas and the Karaites. But more than that, I think what really strikes us is not the question of borrowing or influence, but beyond that is the phenomenology. And the question is whether whether we have a different phenomenology about the way the principle of one flesh is treated and affect the legal rulings within the Christian tradition and the Karaite tradition. And within the article I pointed one basic distinction, and that is that while in the Christian tradition, the principle is understood in corporeal terms. Namely that they understand the idea of one flesh, that practically the man and the women are considered as one body. Therefore, all the other blood relatives are referring to the very same, not only person, but also body. Whereas in the Karaite side, it's more spiritual understanding of the principle, therefore they also make the shift to one soul rather than one body. But more than that, they can tolerate the idea of divorce. And as we saw in the other, as we saw in the other text, the practical meaning of one flesh is not, as we say, Catholic union. Namely, a person can have other unions, but they still keep, or I would say transmit the same idea of selfness. But here I want to emphasize a different aspect, and that is that we have a different way to situate the relations between law and theology. While for the Karaites, the idea of one flesh is a legal fact, not a verse that reflects some truth or divine reality. It is a legal fact, namely it is part of the law itself, therefore it has to coerce with other aspects of the law, and it is not committed to any other metaphysics. Here I come to draw the conclusion. So I'd like to draw several conclusions very briefly. First, to the same extent that nowadays we are quite aware to the fact that religion is not a neutral term, I would also argue that theology and law are not neutral terms. Not neutral, nor universal. Theology in the Christian context, I think, goes back, to the book of Revelation of St. John, where he says, in the beginning there was the Logos. In that respect, St. John is trying to respond to the question of Logos, which was articulated in the Greek thought. And theology all the way to Middle Ages is, in a way, continuing the Greek idea of reflecting about the Logos. In that respect, if I have time, I'll refer later. Theology, if there is something like theology in Judeo-Islamic part, has to do with the idea of al-amar ilahi, which Maimonides and Al-Farabi and others make the differences between law and al-amar ilahi. And also law is not a neutral term. I will not elaborate on that. I would just say that I think one of the indications for my reading of Al-Farabi is that in his commentary to the laws of Plato, where it comes to the part where there's a dialogue between the Athenian and the one who comes to investigate the laws, and he suggests that the law is, above all, a communicative device that aims to cure the society. He just escaped that part. And he doesn't accept the Greek idea of the law. He has a different idea of the law, which is a given content, which is, I would say, a stand-alone principle rather than a reflection of some higher reality. Thank you.
Thank you very much.